We're continuing on in our study of the Northeast region, and we are continuing on lesson 3. You should be on page 192 in your book, and you can follow along. I want you to take a first look at the timeline that this period that we're talking about is between the years 1890 and the year 2000. And the title is Immigrants in the Northeast. Read aloud. Benjamin Edberg came to New York from Russia in 1905. Everybody's dream in the old country was to go to America. He later said, "We heard people were free." So I want to take a quick look at our vocabulary. We're going to be looking at things called, we want to know what life was like for immigrants in New York City. We're going to look at the words tenement and sweatshop, and we're also going to look at the places of New York City and Ellis Island. We've just read about the American Revolution, which made our country independent. In the early days of our country, most of the people who came here were from Northern European countries, such as England, Ireland, and Germany. We've also read about the many Africans who were brought here by force and enslaved. Between 1890 and 1914, the stream of immigrants turned into a flood. More than 12 million people arrived on America's shores. That's almost as many people as live in the state of New York today. Many of these immigrants came from Poland, Russia, Italy, and Greece. Others came from China, Japan, and Mexico. Most immigrants arrived by boat on the Pacific or the Atlantic coast. And we are located on, the Atlantic coast. They settled in every part of our country. Millions, however, stayed where they landed, in New York City. They made the Northeast an exciting region of all different ethnic groups. Just think of all those people in one area from all those different countries. What a great group of people to have together. Continue reading on page 193. I'll get you to the top. The Ellis Island Museum. Imagine your class is visiting the Ellis Island Immigration Museum. Before you go inside, your guide might explain that a ship usually took about 3 weeks to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Oh, I don't think I could be on a ship for 3 weeks. Few immigrants enjoyed the long, crowded voyage. No wonder they rejoiced when they saw the New York City skyline. Their first stop, however, was Ellis Island, a mile off the coast. So they see it, they're almost there, and then they have to stop. Beginning in 1982, this island welcomed 17 million people to the United States. After closing in 1954, Ellis Island opened as a museum in 1990. Here's what it was like to arrive at Ellis Island. This is where the boats docked, your guide explains. Sometimes 5,000 people a day walked through these doors. Guards tied numbered tags to their coats. Then they were shown to the registry room. Today, this enormous room is quiet, but back then it hummed with dozens of languages. Long lines of people waited to be examined by doctors to make sure they were healthy enough to work. Some were sent back home. Oh my word, the long voyage, 3 weeks plus, and now they get here and then they get sent back home. That must have been so disheartening. Most went on to an immigration officer. "Where are you from?" the officer asked. "What kind of work can you do? Can you read and write?" After these questions, most immigrants were shown out of the registry room. They walked down a hallway to the door that said, "Push to New York." Beyond that door was a ferry, New York City, and the United States. So again, let's take a look at this picture. This is what Ellis Island looked like. This is the New York Harbor. This is about the year 1905, what it might have looked as they came into the harbor and saw this place. And this is the first place they landed. Now remember, when they're asked their name, some of them didn't speak English. So now can you imagine if you're a person and somebody is saying their name and their name sounds very foreign, different language, can you see how the spellings and names change when they came over here sometimes because of how people wrote it down when they couldn't speak English? That was a hard time. All right, turn to page 194. We're going to continue our reading. Life in a tenement. Wow. For most immigrants, New York was like no city they had ever seen. The streets were crammed with carriages and cars. The tall buildings seemed to touch the clouds. "Everything was so big to me here," remembers Grace Calabresi, "because I came from a small village in Italy." Most immigrants arrived with little money. Many of them settled in crowded neighborhoods lined with tenements. A tenement is a poorly built apartment building. Often they were cramped and unsafe. Tenement life was difficult. Often 5 or 6 people would sleep in one tiny room. At least some of you have your own bedroom, so can you imagine 5 or 6 in one tiny room? There were few windows, so little light or air entered. The streets outside were noisy and dirty. Read how one immigrant remembered his tenement apartment. What do you think it was like to live in a tenement? Let's read this little part here. This is an excerpt. An excerpt means a piece from a story written by Samuel Chatsanoff in 1953, and it was called A Lost Paradise. This is a piece of it. Privacy in the home was practically unknown. The average apartment consisted of 3 rooms, a kitchen, a parlor, kind of like our living rooms or family rooms, and a doorless and windowless bedroom between. The parlor became a sleeping room at night. So did the kitchen when the families were unusually large. Wow. You're sleeping in the kitchen. Well, I guess you wouldn't have to get up too far to get a snack then, but that would still not be a great situation to be in. Let's continue. Struggling and surviving. Immigrants did all sorts of jobs to support themselves. Some sold goods from push carts, anything from books to socks to bananas. A push cart is a thing obviously on wheels that they would push, kind of like a food cart that you might see in New York at this time, but they would push it around instead of hooking it up to a car and dragging it around. Countless others went to work in the needle trades, which means making clothing. America was not always the dream that immigrants had imagined, yet they were determined to make life for themselves here. An immigrant from China named Arthur Wong was able to buy his own business after years of hard work. He said, "Certainly, I don't think there's any other place in the world we could do what we did with what I have. All I have is 10 fingers, but I had the opportunity or chance to prove what a person can do." And there is, again, a picture of that push cart. And those people would be called peddlers because they'd be selling things. Right, on to page 195. Oh, sorry about that. Take a look at that factory. The needle trades grew rapidly during the late 1800s and early 1900s. New York City became the center of the country's garment or clothing industry. The Industrial Revolution made this growth possible. Remember, we talked about the Industrial Revolution before. It's when they started getting rid of people power and used machinery to do the job of people to make more things faster. The Industrial Revolution made this growth possible. Instead of sewing a shirt or dress by hand, a worker could now use a sewing machine. Goods were produced much faster. Even immigrants who spoke no English could be trained to use sewing machines quickly. Sweatshops. The clothing factories had jobs to offer, yet they were often terrible places to work. The pay was very low. The workers labored for 12 or 14 hours each day, and most of these factories were no more than rooms of tenements, dark and airless. They were known as sweatshops. Well, yeah, no windows, no light, no doors. It was hot in there. I would not have survived. Up at the top, there's a picture. It says the garment factory had more windows, light, and air than most, this one. So that was lucky. Look at all the windows they had. So that was easier for them. Many of the garment workers were Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. Harry Rosalenko later wrote about the sweatshop where his father worked. It was a factory with 100 workers, he noted, where all sorts of tailoring, cutting, and pressing machines were whirring and steaming away. The workers were producing winter wear, heavy coats and cloaks. In the summertime, outside the temperature was almost 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Indoors, it rose to 110 degrees or 120 degrees. Humid, steamy, gluey. You know when you're outside in the summer and it's the sun's out, but you could just stand there and your skin feels sticky. That's what humid is. That's this word here. Later, new laws improved conditions in garment factories. But for years, workers like Harry Rosalenko's father put up with the summer sweat, the winter sweat, and all sorts of sweat. And on to 196. And this is the story of an immigrant today. You can see her picture on the top. This is Miriam Mahia, and she lives in New York City. The stores they had were called bodegas, and they sell groceries and newspapers. They're an important part of many Spanish-speaking communities. All right, Santo Domingo. Now, I can't read this, but I know some people in our classroom can do a really good job with that for me. An immigrant today. Today, the United States is still the goal of many immigrants. Over 17 million have arrived here since 1965. In chapter 2, we read that the immigrants of today differ from those of early 1900s. They're more likely to come from the Caribbean islands, Central America, South America, or Asia. Today, most immigrants arrive by airplane, not by boat. How else do they differ? In what ways are they like the earlier wave of new arrivals? A Dominican immigrant. Here's Miriam Mejia. She lives in a New York neighborhood called Washington Heights. Until 1988, her home was the Dominican Republic. This country is located on an island in the Caribbean Sea. Why did Miriam Mejia come to the United States? My husband Luis moved here first 9 years ago, she explains. He had come to visit his cousin in New York. He stayed because of the many job opportunities, and since we are a close family, we came to join him. Like earlier immigrants, Mejia enjoys reminders of her old home. I live in a Dominican neighborhood, she says. I can shop for special foods such as plantains in a Dominican grocery, and we had some of those at the beginning of the year. There are 3 different Dominican newspapers on sale, and many of her neighbors here speak Spanish. New opportunities. Life remains hard for many immigrants. Some still work in New York's garment district. A wider variety of opportunities are open to the immigrants of today, though. Miriam Mejia works for the Alliance Dominica, for example. This organization helps Dominican immigrants who live in the New York City area. I run the immunization program, Mejia says. We make sure that kids under 5 years old get shots they need to stay healthy. Does Mejia feel like a Dominican or an American? Well, she feels like both. I will never lose my heritage, she points out. It's something deep inside me. But it's important to be a United States citizen. It's the only way to vote, to elect the people who run the government. Miriam Mejia plans to become a United States citizen. She shares this dream with millions of immigrants of the past and future. Well, why does this matter? In the past, people often called the United States a melting pot. They thought that people's different cultures melted as they became Americans. Today, many people call the United States a salad bowl instead of a melting pot. This combination of different ingredients is what makes a salad good. Many immigrants use their first language as well as English. They bring customs from their old homes. These new Americans enrich our country as it enriches them. And here it says, how do immigrants become citizens? This is a great government question. An immigrant must be 18 years old to become a citizen. He or she must have lived in the United States for 5 years and be able to read and write English. There's a test on American history and government. Even to become a citizen, you have to take a test. Then he or she may take the oath of allegiance. So when we're doing our Pledge of Allegiance, allegiance means we're going to be loyal to. That's what allegiance means. So here are the facts from this whole chapter, this lesson. A huge wave of immigrants came to the United States during the early part of the 20th century. Many immigrants worked in factories called sweatshops. Immigrants today have different challenges and opportunities from those of the past. So let's think about these questions, see if we can answer them. What happened at Ellis Island? Do you think that you could tell me that in your own words? Well, that's where immigrants entered the United States. Then they were examined by doctors and they were interviewed by officials. Okay, what is a tenement? See if you can remember back. Right, a tenement is a crowded apartment building, and it was very, very crowded and dirty and sweaty and smelly. And it says, what was life like for an immigrant in New York City? Well, immigrants often lived in those crowded neighborhoods, not just the tenements, but their neighborhoods were crowded. Those unsafe tenements, and they worked in sweatshops. See if you can remember what sweatshops were and why they were called sweatshops. Based on what you learned in this lesson, make a conclusion, which we've been doing in reading class as well, about why immigrants come to the United States. What facts support your conclusion? Oh, this perfectly ties in with our reading this week and this past week. Well, I think that they came here to be free. I'm sure you believe that as well. And there were more job opportunities here. Some of them came just because their relatives were here. And some details that support it is that we enjoy, a U.S. citizen has the right to choose their government. What a great reason to be able to be in a government where we can take part. And the last part says, what factors do you think make New York City a center of immigration? Well, it was right near Ellis Island. And most people had come from Europe, right? And so when they came from Europe, they had to go through Ellis Island, which is New York City. If they weren't speaking English, where would they go? They would sometimes, some people that didn't move away when they came over, they stayed together. And that's why inside New York, we have all these little, like little cities inside of New York City where groups of people who came from the same country stay together because they were able to communicate and grow and adapt to life in the United States.